My name's Keevil, as the slide shows. I'm an archaeological consultant based in Oxfordshire, but working anywhere across the country. And I do a lot of work in Kent in particular. I'm the cathedral archaeologist for Rochester. And partly through that connection, I got involved with the Old House project at Boxley. It's an amazing project, an amazing building, an amazing site for all sorts of reasons, some of which I'll go through with you during this presentation. A little bit of brief background. The particular site, the Old House, is known as St Andrew's Chapel. Whether it really was a chapel is a slightly moot point, but that's its traditional, if you like, ascription. And it was basically attendant to the Cistercian Abbey at Boxley Abbey, which, as this slide shows, is literally just down the road. If this will show, this is Boxley Abbey here. The outline that I'm going around there is the inner precinct wall, which survives remarkably intact, medieval precinct wall. And the abbey itself is in this area. What's highlighted there is Boxley Abbey House, the post-dissolution residence that was converted out of the cloister area and parts of the buildings. But all of this ceased to exist as an abbey, obviously, at the dissolution of the monasteries. This is St Andrew's Chapel down here in the corner. And one of the reasons why it's been ascribed to being a chapel, well, apart from the building itself, is its location possibly as a gatehouse chapel. The principal gatehouse into the inner precinct was in this location at the end of this little road here. That gateway still survives. There may have been an outer gate somewhere in this area. So, as it says, founded in 1143 to 46, somewhere in between. The exact date isn't known, depends on what calendar you use. Dissolved in 1538. It was a direct foundation from Clairvaux in France, so it was one of the early wave of Cistercian abbeys. Why are we actually looking at it from an archaeological perspective, which is obviously my specific remit on the project? Well, there's all sorts of reasons, really. First and foremost, we need to understand the building itself before we can make any informed changes to it. The whole process of informed and conservative change and repair being obviously fundamental to SPAB. The area around the building itself, the curtilage from the listing point of view, that's also important. It has archaeological potential. And in the wider sense, there is the overall landscape setting, what the building is doing there, why it's where it is, how it relates not only to the abbey itself, but to the whole landscape around it. And fundamentally, of course, as an adjunct, almost irrespective of what kind of building it was, it is that relationship with Boxley Abbey itself that's crucial. This particular slide is taken from the National Heritage List mapping, and it shows, obviously enough, as I already mentioned, the precinct here. That's a scheduled ancient monument, so that's the first, if you like, the primary designation for the site. That's specifically to do with its archaeological significance, the importance of particularly the below ground remains, but also what's at surface level, and to some degree, some of the buildings themselves. Interestingly, it's a slight aside, but this building here, the Hospitium, which you'll see in a moment, is actually specifically included in the scheduled monument, as well as being a Grade 1 listed building in its own right. Otherwise, the little blue triangles, if you're familiar with the National Heritage List, these denote listed buildings. Obviously, Grade 1s, I've just said that they're the Hospitium, Boxley Abbey House, Grade 2 star, St Andrew's Chapel, 2 star, the Gatehouse Cottages and the farm here, I think those are both Grade 2. So there's a designation system in place. There are processes that go with that, listed building consent and the like, for the changes that might need to come forward for the chapel. Obviously, the scheduled monument side of it doesn't directly apply to us because, as you can see, the chapel site itself and its curtilage I was just describing, this bit here, are not actually included in the schedule. Nevertheless, within the National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, there is a whole section on heritage and conservation of heritage assets, designated ones and undesignated ones. And so the planning framework really does require that archaeology is considered. And that's been the case for quite some time now. It's a material consideration in the planning process. These are just a couple of slides of Boxley Abbey itself. On this side, this is the remarkable Hospitium. sometimes referred to as a barn. In fact, it wasn't. It appears to have originated as a hostel, if you like, for travellers, particularly pilgrims coming to the site. And as you can see by the sheer size of it, it's an enormous and incredibly impressive structure, both listed and, as I say, part of the schedule monument. Over on this side, we have ruined elements of the abbey itself. This is where part of the church used to be. These walls have been substantially rebuilt after the dissolution, but over here, just inside there, would have been the abbey church. So this photo is taken sort of from within the cloister. And obviously on the first slide and to come, we've got the chapel itself as well. Sources for studying a site like this are many and various. We have all sorts of historical documents associated with the building, original, medieval and later documents. There's quite a wealth of information in the National Archives, specifically about Boxley as a Cistercian abbey. All sorts of documents survive there. In some ways more valuable, though, it is the material for the post-dissolution period, when it passed out into private ownership and went through all sorts of different ownerships, but nevertheless staying as a core of the whole monastic estate. There are various illustrations of photographs, postcards and the like, and those have been very useful for looking at the building. But from my perspective, especially looking at the archaeology of the landscape, maps and surveys are incredibly useful. There are some very good ones of this area from the very late 17th century onwards, sorry, 18th century, I should say. And this is probably the most important of all of them, in a sense. This was a survey drawn up about 1805 for the then owner of the abbey. And as you can see, just comparing that shape to the slide I just showed you of the scheduled monument, it's a very good, accurate survey of the site itself. It shows various ponds. This is probably a post-dissolution show pond, if you like, a piece of landscaping. These ones down here are potentially medieval fish ponds in origin, at least, and this complex network of water channels associated with those. This is the abbey house. This is where the abbey itself used to be. Cloister in here, formal gardens, all sorts of fascinating stuff going on. One of the reasons why these sort of surveys are so useful and important, though, is that it does show you elements that don't survive anymore. Here's the hospitium, which obviously does. You've also got several ranges of buildings up in this area to the north of the hospitium. Those don't survive. Those are no longer visible on the ground. They may well survive below ground, rather hope they do. They're probably, I would imagine, post-dissolution, but they don't need to be. They could be medieval in origin, at least. So that you've got all sorts of fascinating things there in terms of the targets to look for as and when or if we get an opportunity to do investigations on the Abbey site, which is a slightly separate matter from the OHP, the Old House Project. And from my perspective specifically, we have all sorts of purely archaeological information to look through, the core data, if you like, from the perspective of trying to find out what else there is that we already know about the chapel before we really start researching it directly. There are a series of sources here, relatively straightforward things that we usually look through. The National Heritage List itself, or the designations, so the scheduling, the listing we've just talked about. The particularly important one, the Kent Historic Environment Record held by Kent County Council. This is a map and GIS based catalogue, essentially, of everything that's known from past archaeological work right the way up to current work going on in the county of Kent. There are these kind of records for virtually all areas of the country, and Kent's a particularly good one. I'll show you an example of that shortly. Behind that, there are then all sorts of reports and publications, things that people have written about Boxley over the years, particularly some excavation reports for the Abbey. There have been a number of excavations on the Abbey site here itself. Virtually nothing previously on the chapel, interestingly enough. I don't think there's anything recorded in terms of work on that site. The only thing on the Historic Environment Record is just the record of the building itself. No previous work until SPAB took over a couple of years ago. The Historic England Archive has all sorts of resources, aerial photographs, the England's Places, collection of historic photographs from the old red boxes. There's an amazing amount we can get from historic England. Not so easy to access at the moment, of course, because of the COVID-19 crisis. The Archive Centre in Swindon has been closed since mid-March, which is unfortunate, but nevertheless we know it's there when we can get back to it, and it's an amazing resource. And then LIDAR, and that's a form of aerial photography, which I'll come on to in a moment and show you some examples of that. So just a quick run through some of the historic map information for the site. This is, well, the pair of maps basically. You've already seen the survey of the Abbey with the close-in survey from 1805 on here on the left-hand side as I'm looking at it, and as it will be on your screen as well. This is the tithe map from 1849. Again, that very recognizable shape of the Abbey precinct down here. This is the chapel. And the lovely thing about these maps, for a start, they're really accurate. They are very, very good. You can actually overlay them on OS maps, and with a little bit of tweaking, you can do really nice sort of comparisons of these maps with the current status. But they also show in incredible detail the whole layout of the landscape, each individual field, every single one of them enumerated to a specific person as owner, and a separate person as occupier and user, if you like, of the space. It'll define what it is, whether it's meadow, orchard, pasture, whatever. And you can see there are various bits of water courses and other features up here as well. Then running on a bit on this side, the right hand side, we have the first edition Ordnance Survey 1869. I think this is a 6-inch, so 1 to 10,560 scale. Again, showing the Abbey, the chapel, and the whole area around it. Interesting little aside here, you can see it's already at this stage got that antiquity type description, St Andrew's Chapel, and underneath you might just be able to read, now a dwelling house. Clearly they were making a point that it had changed its function. One of the earlier maps, I think it might be part of the 1805 survey, actually shows this little building here and specifically refers to it as an old barn. That's quite interesting in its own right for reasons which will become apparent later on. Moving further on, two more of the Ordnance Survey editions now. These are the 25-inch to the mile maps, so 1 to 2,500 scale. Incredibly useful historically, archaeologically, all sorts of reasons, simply because of the large scale of the mapping. You can see a lot more on them. They are more millimeter almost accurate. I'm not quite sure you'd say they're exactly that, but they are very, very accurate, extremely good maps. And from the perspective of the chapel site here, you can see there's the building itself, which you see more of shortly, and a little outbuilding here on the northwest side of its curtilage. Looking at the next edition, 1908, so only 10 years roughly between them. Down here you see a very different picture. You've still got the chapel, but the small building has now been expanded into a much larger range. There are some documentary references which do suggest that there were 2 cottages on the site at about this time. So whether this is actually a separate dwelling, well, we don't know, we may never know, but it's an interesting sort of sideline, if you like, to the overall story of the property. So on to purely archaeological records now. And this is a screenshot of the mapping we get back from the Kent Historic Environment Record. You get this kind of thing from most of the HERs around the country. As I say, it is a GIS-based system, so you can get these as shape files and manipulate them yourself, or what I usually do, because it's just a little bit easier from my perspective, I'm not that techie, I get them as PDFs like this. And every single one of these little symbols here, which you can see on the right-hand side as to what they all are, listed buildings, crash sites, airplane crashes, that is, farmsteads, monuments, all that sort of thing. And all these numbers represent individual archaeological sites. The blue circle is a 1 kilometer radius from the chapel site itself, right here in the middle. So you can see from that, and this is only one of several maps, this just records previously known sites and finds, things like Roman coins, bits of prehistoric flint work, whatever it may be, and also the various buildings, listed buildings and so forth in the area. But there's a lot going on there. An important point to note straight away, this red line coming down here, that's the Roman road from Rochester through Maidstone down to Hastings. very, very important part of the historic landscape, and no accident, I'm absolutely certain, between the relationship of Boxley Abbey itself over here and that road. It must have been still a very important feature and one of the determining factors for why this particular location was chosen. And then this is the kind of source information that we have behind that. This is a plan published in the County Archaeological Journal Archaeological in, I think it's 1973, by Peter Tester, who had carried out excavations, as you can see on the plan, in 1971 to 2, really to try and delineate the ground plan of the abbey itself. So very small scale, very talented, targeted, what we would call evaluation trenches or pits. You can just about see those as the slightly darker blobs in various places. I suspect the actual excavations are a little larger than that, otherwise he was very accurate with what he was doing. But all he's trying to show here is where he found walls and then how he has interpreted that in the overall ground plan of the abbey. Obviously with the north point here, you can see this is sort of turned on its side compared to what you would expect, so ignore the fact that the church itself seems to be pointing upwards. In its original true orientation, it is pretty much east-west. So a reasonable amount of work has been done on the abbey site itself, but by no means comprehensive excavation. It is a very large, substantial site, and there is plenty more that could be done there. But as I already said, as far as the chapel is concerned, no previous work, not even this relatively small scale of archaeological investigation. Moving on, this is what I referred to just now, LIDAR, light detection and ranging. It's a kind of aerial photography using laser scanning from airborne sources, airplanes and the like. And it's remarkably good for showing the details of the topography, the archaeological topography of sites like Boxley Abbey. There are two different types of models. There's a digital surface model, DSM, which is what this one is, and this still shows things like the buildings. This is the hospitium down here. This is Abbey House, the farm, the cottages. It also still shows tree cover. So it's limited in areas where there is extensive tree cover, which only affect a relatively small part of the abbey, but nevertheless it's important. The other one, DTM, digital terrain model, this one actually strips out the foliage, strips out the trees, even the buildings as well, and just leaves you with the ground form. The reason why this one looks slightly fuzzy compared to this is that this is done at 50 centimeter resolution. This is only 1 meter, and as you can see, it just loses a little bit in translation, as it were. This is much sharper. This is a little bit fuzzier, but by the same token, you don't see the trees. Getting rid of the wood for the trees, if you like. That's quite handy though, because what it does show you is the survival of things like the fish ponds down here, which you remember I showed you on some of the earlier slides. There's one completely hidden in all the undergrowth and all the trees. There it is. There's another one. There's another one here. Obviously you've got the big pond there, and then all of these water channels. Most of this is all but invisible to the naked eye on site. I've been on this site, and you're not really aware. You can see that there are earthworks, you can see there are things going on, but you're not really aware of what the humps and bumps mean. It's also great though, because you can start to pick out potentially buildings. There's what looks like one there. And also stratigraphy. Archaeological stratigraphy is something we're very keen on. It shows you the relationship between ditches, pits and the like on excavations. You can start to see it even on the ground here, in that you have some features like this one coming through and that one, which appear to cut across earlier enclosures and earlier earthworks. Instinctively, I would say these are likely to be post-medieval and part of the house complex and the landscaping for it, whereas these ones are perhaps much more likely to be monastic. So there's a lot of complexity going on there as well. This is just a quick slide to show you some of the limitations, if you like, of the LIDAR. It's great on specific sites like the Abbey if you actually have the coverage. The big blank white bit of the screen over here isn't because I've cut it off. It's just because the photography has not actually extended to that area. Imagine how frustrating it would have been if they decided, well, there's the M20, sod it, we're not going to take any more slides further to the north of that. We would have missed the Abbey completely. So that's a bit of a shame. It's also not terribly good in large built-up areas like most of Maidstone down here. But in the rest of it, where you can see to the field surfaces, there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on. You know, you've got more potential archaeology up here, over here, down here. Not all of it necessarily related to the Abbey and the complex, but some of it probably is. So on to the building. This is the chapel, St Andrew's Chapel. Just the slide itself almost speaks for itself, doesn't it? It's an amazing building. It's extremely complicated. I wouldn't begin to say that we fully understand it yet. It might be that we don't ever completely fully understand its historical complexity, but there are all sorts of ins and outs of how you interpret a building like this and which bit came first, which was built after. I mean, just in this slide alone, and you've got a timber frame section here, you've got a replaced medieval window. This is a 15th or early 16th century window, which has actually been plonked in there somewhere around 1900. It's not from that location originally at all. There are illustrations which show that window not there. You've got a relationship here. This wall looks as though it's built against that one, or is it the other way around? You've got the timber frame here. Which bit comes first? Is the brick earlier? Is the stone earlier? It's fascinating to go in and pick out these kind of details. As a corollary of that, it's great to look at a photograph, but what we really need are the detailed, accurate measured surveys that we can actually have of the elevations, the ground plan, and indeed 3D modelling. And one of the first things that SPAB did was to commission all that kind of work. So that's all being done, and there are some fantastic 3D models and indeed all the elevations and plans and everything that you could possibly want. So that's a fundamental. We need that before we really start to try and unpick it. And the 3D element of that is actually surprisingly crucial, because there are times when you're inside or outside of a building like this, you can't quite get in your mind's eye how the thing fits together in 3 dimensions. So having that kind of data is actually really helpful, even when you're on site. And it's all about both the big picture, the whole building, but also tiny details. Just to give you a case in point, we know that this historic window, okay, it's repositioned, but there are photographs which show that this little lump here and another one here were actually little face corbels, original medieval face corbels, now lost through erosion or damage. So it's that kind of fine detail that we want to try and capture. Everything about the building is important in some way. It's been altered a lot over the years. I should have said at the beginning probably that it's been vacant for 40 to 50 years, so it's had no occupation at all in that time. But it did have quite substantial use in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries. Part of it was in use as a post office, and there are obviously quite a lot of changes to the building inside and out that reflect that. All of those phases are important to some degree, but as part of what we're tasked to do in terms of the planning side of things, listed building consent and all the rest of it, we need to determine what's the most important, what are the things we really need to focus on preserving at all costs, if you like, and where there are other pieces of fabric that we might be able to do some intervention. We can only do that really by looking at the building itself. This is in its previous guise. This is only a year ago. This is what the building looked like last summer, almost exactly a year ago, in fact. But this photograph might have been taken slightly earlier. I think it might be March of last year. It shows the whole of the east elevation of the chapel. This is the chapel proper, assuming it was a chapel, covered in, albeit dead, but nevertheless covered in ivy, very, very heavily covered in vegetation. The whole building was like that. And there wasn't a great deal you could see of it. You can just about, with the eye of faith, maybe make out that there's brick there and brick there, as opposed to stone masonry around it. Well, that overgrowth, all that rubbish, was very carefully and systematically taken off last year, and this is the result. There's a bit of a transformation, I'm sure you'll agree. You can straight away see all the original medieval fabric, all the nice stonework here, the ashlar masonry, the string course there, moulded string course, and the plinth below it. And then where these windows are, and what I was saying over here, the brickwork, very, very clearly, these windows are inserted into brick blocking in what was a very large, tall, pointed arch window, which does give a lot of credence to the idea that this was a chapel. That's the kind of window you expect in the East End of a small chapel and a church, frankly. So nice to see it in this new cleaned up condition. There are other elevations where we've got the same sort of level of new detail. A couple of other views. I won't dwell on these too much. I'm probably going on too long already. But these are on the other side of the building. In essence, that bit you just saw is underneath that roof there. That's the medieval core of the building. These bits, this is a sort of an aisle added onto the south side of it after the dissolution. And this is the west end, which is entirely post-dissolution. The original end of the building was somewhere up about here. We know that from evidence from the interior of the building. So a lot of it is an extension dating probably to the late 16th, 17th century. We don't exactly know when all this happened. You can also see from this photo, you've got a big Patras plate there and a very obviously bowing wall. One of the big concerns for the project as a whole is to stabilize this west elevation and make sure it doesn't actually carry on moving. You can see the massive cracks down here. Really rather alarming from everyone's point of view, something we obviously need to be dealing with. And that's one of the things we've been doing as part of the project so far. Internally, that's the view upstairs of the chapel part of the building. This is the original medieval roof structure up here, which has been dendrochronology dated to 1485, I think it is thereabouts. Anyway, 1485, 1494, somewhere in that region. I forget the exact date. So this is all the original medieval work, and you can see at this point it kind of stops. You've got a bit of an inserted timber, a completely different roof form. They've tried to copy the vaulting, but not really very clearly or well. The wall is much thinner here. All of this whole section is part of the extension of the building after the dissolution. This is the really rather magnificent decorated roof, the beam, the wall plate on the top of the building. You can see that exceptional quality decoration, sort of late 15th century classic of its type. It's an interesting aspect of it, though, that it's slightly difficult to see this in an entirely ecclesiastical context, in a church context anyway. It feels like something which might have been more in a residence than in a chapel, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but that again is part of the work we're going through to try and interpret this building more, just to see what's it actually there for, what was its origin. And finally, coming around to the trial excavations we've carried out so far. We did 9 pits, I think it was, altogether in July 2019 as part of the first working party that SPAB organised here at Boxley. We weren't at that stage and still really limited in our opportunities. There have been no opening up of the building, so no investigations under floors or within walls. So really what we were looking at was the below ground evidence for how the building had developed. And this was a joint enterprise. It was one of those nice occasions when the engineering needs and the archaeological needs both came together, and we had exactly the same aims, the same areas that we wanted to look at. So we targeted our excavation trenches so that we were going to answer both the structural engineers' questions and my own from a purely archaeological perspective. You can maybe make out in some of the slides I've shown you so far that last year the site was very, very overgrown. Geophysical survey was simply impossible because of that, but that has now been done in 2020. Some work was done a couple of weeks ago and didn't really show up very much, but nevertheless has been very useful in giving us some more pointers for the potential of the site as a whole. So, as I say, 9 small pits excavated in July last year, and this is just a quick run through some of them. This is against the eastern wall of the chapel again, so that's the same wall I showed you just now, covered in its ivy, with the plinth here, the chamfered plinth. And this is one of our pits. We had originally planned to do it actually right in this corner. The structural engineer would have preferred that, but he also felt that the footings or lack of them underneath the timber frame section of wall here looked so alarming that perhaps digging down a metre or so next to it was maybe not a good idea. There was also a whopping great Victorian drain channel here. You can see the concrete there. So we just really just took one step further across and dug the pit in this location instead. So we were at least able to get down to the base of the footings of the wall here. And very good thing we did do so, because right at the bottom of the pit, right in this area down here, for a start, we actually found the bottom of the foundations. You can see there's a long way down to get to them. So, okay, this is the current ground level. Medieval ground level is perhaps about here, and the foundations have gone down a good ½ meter below that onto reasonably good geological bearing ground. But more to the point, we actually found late 15th century pottery right down here as well. So that's good evidence for the dating of the foundations, and therefore confirming the evidence from the dendrochronology. So this is another pit. This is against the south wall of that same chapel, the same part of the building. So again, against what we would take to be the late medieval structure. And here again, current ground level about here, you can see that from the level of the moss on the wall. Everything below that is below current ground level, but again, medieval ground level is probably somewhere around about here. Similar sort of foundations, similar sort of masonry, pretty much the same really, and again founded well down into good bearing ground. This little wall here is part of the 19th century alterations, partly to do with the post office, and it's a rather nice little stack of tiles here acting as a foundation for the masonry. Really quite a sweet little detail in its own right. Looking a bit further around the building, the story didn't look quite so promising. This is now on the southwest corner. This is the junction between the two walls which were added after the dissolution. So on the left here you have the gable end we were looking at earlier on, and on the right you have the aisle wall. And as you can see, quite a lot of movement going on here, just as there was, as you could see earlier, on that side. Some past attempts to patch that up with a little bit of mortar to try and close the joints up, not very successfully. And again, from the engineer's point of view, this is somewhere where he particularly wanted to see what was going on below ground. The slightly alarming answer was, by the looks of it, not very much. We've got one extra course of masonry footing, if you want to call it that, here, and a couple of the stones, and that's basically it. It doesn't seem to have fundamentally any footings. We could press a trowel or anything we liked way under here without hitting anything solid. A couple of little one gas and one water pipes down here, they may have affected things as well. But that stone, you can see it's actually dropped over the top of these two little blocks here, which are probably nothing to do with the foundations at all. So it's actually moving, or has moved quite a bit in the past, which no doubt explains quite a bit of all that that's going on. You can also see the extent of the erosion of the masonry here. This should be a nicely detailed plinth course, but it's almost completely lost at that corner. Moving further on, here is again that south aisle wall, and at this point it's joining on to a building which conventionally everyone had thought of was probably medieval, and a priest's lodging to do with the chapel. So the priest who was actually in charge of delivering services and the like in the chapel and looking after the holy relics and whatever was there, that this was his residence, his own personal chambers. In fact, when we looked at the masonry, it looks as though these two walls are bonded together. In other words, they're built all at the same time. They're not actually two separate things. If that one had been added to that one, it should have a very clear butt joint. So you should see a clear straight line between that one resting against that. Think about how you build a Lego wall. You know, it's whether it's all fully attached and keyed in or not. These two walls are keyed in together. Little bit of foundation here, at least, in contrast to what we saw a bit further along. But there's a clear gap between the post-dissolution masonry of the extension and this stonework under here. I hesitate to call it a foundation. A little bit further along on the same wall, the same thing happens. You've got the really nice quality ashlar masonry, probably reused monastic stone, almost certainly that, particularly because of the way the detailing here is so similar to the other medieval masonry at the chapel. But you get, again, the ranging rod rather hides it, unfortunately, but you've got a clear gap between the masonry of the wall and this masonry underneath it. We would need to do more work to prove this one way or the other, but my suspicion is that this masonry is actually a different phase, a completely earlier building, if you like, which they've just taken the opportunity to use to build over with this extension to the chapel after the dissolution. But I say we would need to do more work to be able to prove that. But this just shows you the kind of value of even very small scale targeted excavations, but also, I suppose, to a degree, the frustrations. You can end up asking as many questions as you actually end up answering. So just very briefly, to sort of wrap up some of that, I was referring to earlier on the fact that we need to try and understand something like St Andrew's Chapel in the context of its much wider context. Now, you can take that as wide as you like. You can go to the national and even international levels of things like international Cistercian studies. But more importantly, I think, well, let's walk before we try to learn to run or jump over hurdles or whatever. The walking in this case is to try and understand how the building here fits in with the abbey here and with the wider context of the area around it. The black lines here, slightly crudely drawn in, that's the Roman road. This is the Pilgrim's Way, a natural route, certainly used in prehistory and in Roman times. And obviously very much, as the name suggests, as you can see here, Pilgrim's Road, used in the medieval and later periods. It still has that important sense of pilgrimage from Canterbury through to Rochester and on into London and to Winchester and beyond. So it's an important feature in the landscape in its own right. These are determining factors, I'm sure, in the choice of this particular location for the abbey itself. But more to the point, how does our building fit in with this wider landscape? The orange lines here highlight the extent of the estate as it existed in the 1880s, when the Earl of Aylesbury, who was landowner at the time, was consolidating land and trying to get back, if you like, a big historic estate. His land holdings extend way off in this area as well, so it just stops here because that was where I got to with my rather crude drawings at the time. But this is probably a fairly good reflection of the medieval land holdings of Boxley Abbey itself. I've also highlighted here a number of important place names. So you've got Borley Warren, Boxley Warren. These probably indicate abbey farming, not necessarily in the medieval period, but they certainly were farmed in that way. You have Lower Grange down here, you have Boxley Grange. These are two of the home farms of the medieval abbey. So again, post-medieval and later buildings as they now stand, but very much part of the monastic context. And as I say, all of this land plus more, which actually is the original land holding of the abbey. Here is the inner precinct. Where was the outer precinct? Was there a gate? Was this a gatehouse chapel? Well, jury's still out on that a little bit, but if you imagine, well, we know it's not imagination, that's the inner precinct, that's the core of monastic life. The real core of the monks' lives is here in the abbey itself, but this is, if you like, the beating heart. Where's the rest? Well, the lane here looks important to me, especially the way it goes out to the Pilgrim's Way. You've got Borley Farm there on it. You've obviously got all the Warrens and these other place names. The farms, I think, would have been outside the outer precinct. They didn't have to be, but I would expect them to be. So I think you've almost got sort of two sides, potentially three sides of what could have been the outer precinct, and maybe we can even start to join it up. It's almost speculation, but you know, this is one of the fascinations of looking in this sort of detail at this kind of amazingly complicated landscape and trying to work out how it all fits together. We've started to scratch the surface with the work we've done over the last year or so. And on that, where have we got to and what do we need to do next? Well, the most important thing in a way is that we've just, SPAB that is, received planning permission for access and enabling works. We need to be able to get machines, offices, storage and all sorts of other stuff onto the site before anything can be done with the building itself. And I provided a desk-based archaeological assessment as a part of that process. Moving on from that, we've got ongoing consultations with the local planning authority with Historic England, with statutory consultees, all sorts of people, on the ideas that are coming forward for how the building itself needs to be conserved, refurbished, and given a proper use for the future, something which is going to be viable, sustainable, all of those buzzwords. But they're actually critical in this context, because if they don't have that, if the building doesn't have that, it's just going to carry on falling apart. We can't let that happen, and SPAB aren't going to let that happen. And obviously, as a fundamental to that, going right back to the beginning, all the plans for the site have to be informed by what we know about it. We need to have good information. We need to be constantly building on our understanding of the building and getting to the best possible position we can be in before we can really decide what needs to happen. That is an ongoing iterative process. Every time we answer a question, as say, we end up asking one or two more. But it is pretty much fundamental. It has to be the whole basis of what we're doing, that we're constantly learning from the building, and therefore putting ourselves in the best position to give it this future that it so richly deserves. We will end up doing a lot more work, I'm sure of that. Everybody wants that. Everybody's keen and really enthusiastic about the building. We've got a little bit more work to do in a few weeks' time, which will give us more insights, more answers, and again, probably ask some more questions. But that's part of the whole process. The more we understand the building, the better we're able to secure it for the future and pass it on to future generations.